From Paris runways to Milan catwalks, India-inspired fashion is everywhere. But this global love affair has also reignited conversations around inspiration, appropriation, and the question of credit. First, the good bit. French luxury label Louis Vuitton had models walk down a striking snakes and ladders themed runway designed by renowned Indian architect Phyllida Jay with music from A.R. Rahman pulsating in the background. It was on point for the brand that had titled its Spring-Summer 2026 men's collection a voyage to India. But just a few days before that in Milan, on June 22nd, controversy struck when Italian luxury house Prada sent models strutting in open-toe leather sandals inspired by GI-tagged Kolhapuri chappals. They did so without crediting Kolhapuri artisans for the inspiration. The furor that followed led to Prada admitting its mistake. A technical team from the brand visited Kolhapur this week and met up with local artisans for a possible collaboration. But these outcomes are rare. And the reality is that the whole shebang is nothing new. From designs to dishes, from paintings to pottery, and from tea to even rice, Indian origin goods have found themselves at the receiving end of imitation over many years. So what is different now? Well, the Desi consumer is now influential enough to command attention with all the buzz around the growth potential of India's luxury market. I spoke to Phyllida Jay, an anthropologist and author of Inspired by India, about where India stands in today's global fashion conversation, between endlessly being mined for aesthetic inspiration and finally being credited for it. We discussed the fine line between appreciation and appropriation, the Prada Kolhapuri sandal controversy, and what true recognition for India's karigars could look like. It is Thursday, July 17th. I'm your host, Apoorva Mittal, and this is the Morning Brief. In her novel, Phyllida traces India's role in global design from the 1600s to the present. She also raises concerns about colonial exploitation and the cultural appropriation that fueled the early proliferation of Indian aesthetics worldwide. So I wanted to understand the roots that bring us to the current moment.
It's such a good point that you make here, Apoorva, that there's a long continuity and we're in a very particular moment of understanding India's place within global design discourse. And these social media eruptions are a powerful example of just how political fashion is and reflects its importance in defining cultural identity. The growth, real, predicted or otherwise, of India's luxury market is intimately conflated with a growing narrative of resurgence and rightful redress from the long shadow of colonialism. In this sense, luxury brands, and particularly when they use Indian inspirational crafts, become almost allegorical for colonialism in people's perception of this churn of history. But it's also true that this can sometimes result in clickbait outrage feeding into shrill nationalism, rather than a more nuanced understanding of cross-cultural design fertilization and how India has inspired global design for centuries. Because design is not just about aesthetics or functionality, it also carries cultural meaning and can reflect or reinforce cultural values. From the 16th to 18th centuries, the Indian textile trade was central in the development of an international language of design. It created new forms of hybridity that evolved through complex dynamics of design exchange and interpretation, the translation of external ideas and imagery, powered by the forces of commerce. So the current moment we find ourselves in is indeed fascinating. We have the growing visibility of Indian fashion designers internationally, as well as a lot of buzz around the growth potential of India's luxury market. And that's in no small part fueled by the global visibility and spectacle of the Ambanis, the very particular idea of India they represent, and not least the big push by Reliance to bring luxury brands into India. I think at the same time, there's more than ever an awareness of craft and luxury as vital forms of soft power, and we can see the Ambanis really tapping into that. And this is all piquing interest more than ever at a time when luxury brands are grappling with a general slowdown in established markets. Everyone is looking towards India.
But gaffes have always been part of this story. Social media recently erupted over Gucci's refusal to credit the sari drape worn by Alia Bhatt at Cannes.
Alia Bhatt was not only making her Cannes debut, but also doing so in her role as the first Indian global ambassador for Gucci. It felt like a real fashion moment. So it's a great pity that the brand messaging was so confused, with Gucci referring to it as a little gown rather than directly acknowledging inspiration from the sari or lehenga. There's a sense of momentum, but also frustration in how international brands continue to make these kinds of missteps that reduce Indian culture and design to an afterthought or a set of exotic cliches or erase it altogether. So it's a really good point, Apoorva, of where does India sit within this current global design discourse? Now, all European luxury brands assert their value based on the assumed hegemony and cultural superiority, and I very much want to emphasize assumed, of French or Italian culture and craft heritage. But increasingly, we're seeing just how fractured and unstable this assertion of value is when a large portion of luxury goods are embroidered in places like India or even manufactured in sweatshop conditions in Italy.
That is true. But even Indians borrow liberally, from food to fashion. So, what is appropriation then, and when is something considered appreciation or an inspiration? Should appreciation suffice in the context of all too rich and powerful conglomerates? In Kolhapuri's case, India had a strong argument because the product is GI tagged. But in case of a silhouette, things can get blurry. Phyllida says history and context is important to discern the difference between the two.
It's such an important distinction to make, but it's not always straightforward, and it really comes down to the question of ownership. The question of appropriation is quite clear-cut in people's minds. Many people in India and the diaspora feel strongly attached to this style of sandal. They believe it's an intrinsic part of Indian identity. However, these periodic instances of internet outrage around India's cultural heritage expose several fractured and uncomfortable truths about the state of craft in India. These highly skilled artisans with generations of knowledge are some of the most economically and socially marginalized communities, with a supply chain involving Dalit artisans and Muslim leather workers who are systematically discriminated against for their caste or religion within India. But it's actually the artisans who own this craft. I think this is why Prada sandals felt like such a lost opportunity, and it was so surprising that Prada, of all brands, made this misstep, given the exquisite collection of leather bags and shoes they produced around 2012, I think it was, using braided leather techniques by artisans in Chennai and proudly marketed and labelled as made in India. Like each bag had made in India and an embossed leather stamp inside. And it's absolutely mystifying why Prada didn't work directly with Kolhapuri artisans with clear communication from its press team from the outset. And that would have been appreciation. Instead, it literally copied the sandals, made them in Italy, and with no acknowledgement to add a cliched element of, I'm assuming, bohemian flair to a spring-summer menswear collection. What I found particularly saddening is that even the invitations for the Prada menswear show were decorated with the thumb or the toe ring from the traditional Kolhapuri chapels. And we also saw these rings refashioned into finger rings on the models on the catwalk. And so there was obviously a lot of innovation and joy by the Prada design team in engaging with this traditional craft form, but obviously zero interaction with the actual artisans and zero acknowledgement.
But how much do these instances move the needle in the larger scheme of things? Can these spark a real turning point, or are they as fleeting as viral trends?
I think these social media outcries are inevitable in the noisy attention economy we now find ourselves in. I do think in the specific case of the Kolhapuri chapel, something good might actually come out of all of this. Because this is a very specific craft rather than, say, a silhouette shape or general idea of how something should be worn, such as the notorious Scandi scarf, aka the dupatta. And because Prada has now actually acknowledged the design inspiration, Prada held a meeting last week with the Maharashtra Chamber of Commerce, and they represent 3,000 Kolhapuri chapel artisans, and they discussed the potential opportunities for future collaboration. Lorenzo Bertelli, the Prada son and head of its corporate social responsibility division, joined the talks. The company said the next step will be for Prada's supply chain team to meet a range of artisanal footwear manufacturers. So there's a real opportunity here to contribute positively and sustainably to the organizational infrastructure and innovation potential of Kolhapuri craft.
And what about the positives, like Pharrell's latest collection for LV?
So that's a really good point around what brands have really successfully acknowledged India. And I think that question raises two key aspects. One is aesthetic inspiration. And to be honest, I think we still have a lot of cliches being reproduced about what India is, and two is material production. And I guess that does raise questions around what we really mean by craft and what we mean by luxury and how the two articulate one another. A lot of what we're talking about in terms of luxury for these big European brands is craft, but it's craft adapted to much larger economies of scale and modern branding. And I wonder if that would always accommodate many Indian crafts and where these master artisans work. When it comes to material production, because various factors, notably timescales, very tightly controlled margins of error, and production logistics involving design and merchandising teams, all these big conglomerate brands tend to work with export production houses rather than directly with artisans or craft clusters. Chanel isn't part of a conglomerate but owns its own production ateliers called Vastrikala in southern India. And these brands, there are brands doing good work, not in a loud, splashy way, but in a manner that is truly helping build the foundations for a modern luxury ecosystem in India. For example, Hermès has a long-established relationship with L'Atelier 2M in Mumbai and has always been transparent about embroideries made in India. It clearly labels these on products and on its website. And I think that's really important. I mean, that is acknowledgement. Chanel owns Vastrikala in Tamil Nadu, and they do very beautiful work for interiors as well as fine embroidery for fashion for Lesage, who have worked with all the great couture houses in Paris since the 1920s. And they really work on knowledge transmission between artisans in India and artisans and the design and technical specialists in Paris. Then, of course, there is Chanakya in Mumbai, who've created such memorable artworks and collections with Dior under the creative directorship of Maria Grazia Chiuri. And these are examples of real commitment in building longevity and establishing the kind of infrastructure, knowledge transmission and support for incredible artisanal skills that aligns them to adapt to the technical sourcing and aesthetic demands of global luxury brands. But of course, there are problems inherent in that. And one of the things is these brands must have a commitment. But of course, while Indian craft was really celebrated under Maria Grazia Chiuri, she has now left Dior. And under the first show by Dior's new creative director, Jonathan Anderson, last week, we saw again the problem of exceptional Indian craft go completely unacknowledged in the form of a Dior coat decorated with intricate mukaish or badla work, which is a form, very specialist embroidery, particular to Lucknow. But it's the lack of acknowledgement by Dior that's particularly saddening, because Lucknow has the most incredible craft traditions, and I've spent a lot of time there. And what I've really seen is that artisans desperately need more visibility and infrastructural development, and this can't be at the whim of an individual creative director to brand to acknowledge them or not. In all of the outrage over Prada, I just want to flip the question a little and ask, why do we give brands so much power? And why is it that big international luxury brands still have such power to validate Indian crafts? And I think this goes back maybe to your first question, Apoorva, about global design discourse and India's place within it, and perhaps we are in a moment of transition. And if a brand does work with artisans, and they need to do so in ways that contribute to the broader craft ecosystem in India. And it's actually why, with the right approach, the Prada case could now actually turn into something good. The brand has stated its intent to work closely with a range of actors, as well as the artisans themselves, to build organisational infrastructure, skills transmission, and innovation development.
Even within India, the on-ground awareness is barely there. Though Kolhapuri is GI tagged and thousands of artisans who can make these sandals exist, only 95 artisans have registered as authorized users, owing to low awareness of GI benefits among craftsmen.
It's a huge structural issue that exists within Indian fashion and craft, and this pertains as much to Indian brands as it does to international ones. It's been one of the defining mantras that fashion can add value to craft and therefore the livelihoods of artisans through the medium of design and through elevating products to luxury. It's pretty much all we've heard in the last 10 years. Still, I'm not sure how much that idea has really been proven. All too often, artisans remain at the bottom of the supply chain. They receive a tiny fraction of the retail value. And this disparity is only exacerbated when European luxury brands at really excessive retail pricing enter the picture. We need more sustained campaigns, awareness, and organizational infrastructure for artisans to benefit from their skills, whether by selling directly to consumers or by working with brands in ways that truly work to overcome structural inequities. And really just pay them more. Really, because you can talk about dignity and respect and how much you love craft. But if an artisan whose skill is at the heart of the product you're marketing is receiving not even 5% of the retail price, then the problem remains.
One of the ways used to protect items from such issue is the geographical indication or the GI tag, a global system of labeling used on products that have a specific geographical origin and possess qualities or a reputation due to that origin. Would the Prada controversy have the same result had the Kolhapuri chappals not been GI tagged? Probably not. The latest round of controversies shows a need to raise the pitch and enforce such regulations. It also shows the need to add more Indian craftsmen to the list of GI protected items. India has 643 registered GIs. France has 681 just in food and beverages. For comparison, India is about 6 times the size of France by land area and has 21 times more people. Safeguarding its IP and heritage is something India is lagging behind in. Since 1990, India has cumulatively paid $100.8 billion while receiving only $11 billion in IP receipts, a net $90 billion deficit. This was in an op-ed in ET. The bottom line, if we don't protect and value our own craft and creators, we can't expect anyone else to. That's it for today. This episode was brought to you by sound designer Rajas Nayak and produced by Anirban Chaudhary and Vinay Joshi. Thank you for listening. And if you like today's episode, do spread the word. All new episodes of The Morning Brief drop every Tuesday, Thursday and Friday. It streams on Amazon Prime Music, JioSaavn, Spotify, Apple and Google Podcasts. And of course, ET's own audio platform, ET Play. If you made it this far, have a great week ahead. All clips used in the episode belong to the respective owners. Credits mentioned in the description.